I bring my greetings from southern Belize. I am a Kekchi Maya woman, and I want to give you a greeting in Kekchi. Chancheril masayach all sa sakach all laoch bangkok sa nena sa inse Toronto. Kama Joshire Sage, Director of Sage, o Takish Ramona, kway o sa netiam chish. Tialbal chish olobankil ayru kat angel. Saying it's a pleasure to be here. We want to thank Sage certainly for the invitation. It's an honor to share with you our experiences and our work in southern Belize with respect to the Maya people and our land rights claims. As a way of introduction, I wanted to, since we've been involved with this struggle with the Maya land rights movement for many years now, and it's quite a task to try to put everything into an hour and a half talk. We want to really structure our presentation in a way that gives enough time for you to engage with us through the question and answers, and we're really interested in hearing more what your questions are, what your areas of interest are, and perhaps we can help to enlighten in some way those areas of interest. And so we have structured our talk this afternoon. Both Pabla and myself will be sharing the time. I will speak primarily on the Maya land rights struggle, and Pablo will touch on Indigenous governance and the impacts that has had with respect to the movement. I'd like to offer and share with you a very short film documentary that was prepared in order to support our claim before the courts. We felt that it was important for people to understand the context in which we're bringing forth these land claims, but also understanding a bit historically how the Maya land rights struggle started. And so this particular clip was not used in the case. It was developed more for educational purposes, but a shorter version was developed, which was less talk and more visualization, so that the court could appreciate the nature in which Maya people use and occupy their lands. So we want to start today by showing this video. So I hope that gave you a little bit of context, a little bit of background in terms of our history and in terms of our claim. As you heard in the video, for many years the Maya people have been struggling tirelessly to secure our rights to our lands and our resources, the places we use and the places we occupy. Yesterday in our class, in the class that we spoke in, we began with a theme from a quotation from one of our leaders that says, to see, to respect, and to live. And I felt that it was important, again, for a very intimate group like you, to share that and the meaning behind that. And it really speaks to the video. You know, often we don't even, it's been a long time that I've actually seen that video again. And there's someone in that video that I wanted to recognize tonight, a very dear friend of mine who passed just a couple weeks ago. And realizing that so many people have been involved in this struggle, and realizing that a lot of times as we share our story and as we go and we try to bring awareness towards our work, many times still many communities, many people, many institutions still fail to see the Maya people, to see Indigenous people for who they are. But beyond seeing them, as we've been struggling with our state, it's not just about helping our government to understand that these forests are not empty, but helping our government to come to a higher level of understanding of our way of life, and by doing that, respecting a people's way of life. And until you have reached that space, you cannot begin to live as a people. Today I want to give you, just as by way of a summary background of the actual land rights case, I want to share with you that in 2001, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found, among other things, that the state of Belize had violated our rights as Maya people to the lands that we use and occupy by failing to recognize our customary use and occupation of our ancestral lands, and by failing to title and demarcate, delimit, define the territories that we use and occupy as Maya people. No, that was a very important time, and as you will understand with Indigenous struggles, many times when you take a legal strategy, it begins to isolate community. Not everybody is going to be involved in a court case. Not everybody is going to be involved in the litigation process. And clearly a lot of Indigenous groups, like the communities we come from, we don't even have lawyers. Until this year, we've had now our first Indigenous lawyer in Belize who has joined our case. So to understand that context, it's very difficult, and it's easy to isolate communities if you take on just a legal battle. Our struggle is bigger than that. The legal strategy we've recognized as a tool to begin to assert our rights. But it's a tool that is being used not to prove to ourselves that we have rights to these lands, but really to prove to the outside world that even the courts, even the laws that have been created, that we have adopted, will agree with us that those lands are not vacant, that we live there, that we have continued to make a way of life in those forests, and that by nature of our customary use and occupation of those lands, we have rights. And so in 2001, when the Inter-American Commission made the decision, we could not see that decision until 2004, when it was made public. And around this time, a lot of our leaders had become disheartened. And I will tell you a very personal story. And, a lot of these engagements with institutions, sometimes in order to connect, you really have to understand where communities are coming from. What was the basis of this movement? You heard in the video that it started off with Malaysian logging companies coming onto our lands. For a long time, the area that we occupied was considered the forgotten district. There was a dirt road that led to our district, and nobody really wanted to go there. It took maybe 12 hours on the bus. Sometimes you might break down. There might be flooding, really depending on, what time of the year you were there. And a lot of people didn't go. There was nothing there other than our people and our way of life. And in a lot of ways, that was a blessing, because it ensured that we maintained our connection to the land. We maintained our traditional institutions that has kept our communities. And in the early 90s, when the struggle began with the Malaysian companies, our leaders looked to our elders, and our leaders looked to our young people, those who have had the opportunity for higher education. And one of those people was a young man that I will talk about a little bit. Julian Cho was his name. He was a very powerful speaker. He knew how to engage both his communities, but also the state and also the outside. And he had been out to study. Julian perhaps came at a time when the communities were most ready to organize themselves. And because he knew a bit of both worlds, he spoke the language, he was a high school teacher, and began to engage with the leadership and began to understand, why is it that our state gives concessions without our consent, without even our knowledge? Why is it that they see these lands as empty lands? Is it because we have not asserted ourselves? Is it because we have not made it known that our way of life is forest dependent on the land that we live on? And so he began to organize the communities. At that time, unlike countries like our neighbor Guatemala and Mexico, we do not suffer the same kind of atrocities, or our history is not a violent history. It's a very peaceful history. And for a long time, Maya people remained very passive. We lived peacefully with everybody, and we enjoyed having people visit us and having people live in our communities, and we didn't feel threatened. Our way of life was not threatened. But as soon as the Malaysians came and they began to disrupt our watersheds, they began to tear down our forests, it became a direct livelihood impact and that changes how people respond. And for our communities, it was a deep concern. And so when Julian began to organize, the state's reaction was one where it was very dismissive. You know, these people don't, they hold no regard. I mean, there's no attention given to them. And at that point, we began to lobby not just nationally but internationally, and that's how the petition to the Inter-American Commission came about. The story is not a very pleasant one. In 1998, Julian passed, and as a result of his involvement with this type of organizing, and again, this was such a shock for us because we did not suffer that kind of social unrest, and we recognized at that point that the government was going to insist on violating our rights to the land that we use and occupy, but also that was perhaps the time when we recognized that clearly the Maya people continue to be discriminated against. After the Inter-American Commission gave its recommendations, and it clearly said, you know, we recognize that the Maya people have rights to the lands that they use and occupy. We strongly recommend that the government cease and desist from granting any further concessions, development concessions, grants, land sales, without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Maya people. In addition to that, it says we recommend that the government clearly define, delimit, demarcate, and title those territories to Maya people. And that for us was a huge victory. It was wonderful to have an international body recognize and affirm our rights. At the same time, we knew that the government would not respond because those are recommendations. They're not enforceable in Belize, at least. So the government, as we had anticipated, really has not up to date publicly declared that they lost that hearing. By that time, after Julian's passing, a lot of the leaders became disheartened. They were discouraged. They didn't want to risk their families' lives. When I became involved, by that time it was shortly after the Inter-American Commission gave its ruling, and it was a very important opportunity to regain the hope within the Maya communities. And by 2007, we had filed another case before the Supreme Court, this time in the domestic courts in Belize. And the Supreme Court agreed with us again. In fact, embodying all of what the Inter-American Commission had said, clearly saying, you know, there has been a violation of rights with respect to the way that Maya people describe their forms of property, describe their land tenure systems. And the violation is that the government has not recognized or respected that. And so, again, they were not just recommendations. This was now an order from the highest courts in Belize, the Supreme Court of Belize, to say that the government of Belize has to clearly define, demarcate, delimit the territories of Maya people and title these lands to us, and seize and abstain from giving any further concessions that might disturb the use or enjoyment of our lands without our consent. Again, that was another wonderful victory for our people. But we recognized very quickly that the government interpreted that decision as only being applicable to just the two model communities that we had taken before the courts. And understanding Indigenous communities, we don't have a lot of resources to be going back and forth to the courts. We thought that if we took two model communities, it would be precedent setting, and therefore it would apply to as a sort of a blanket cover on all of our communities. Well, that wasn't the interpretation of the state. And quite honestly, I will tell you, now that I've been involved so many years with the land rights movement, I recognize that the attitude of the government has shifted from that time to present day. In 2007, when we started and we filed that case, the government was very dismissive. They acted like they didn't even care. And now we interpret that, and we know why. For many years, the Maya people have been looked at as second-class citizens. We don't even exist. And so the government, I don't think, even expected us to be able to bring claims before the Supreme Court. I don't think they expected us to be able to put together strong arguments for a court really to analyze our situation. And so they didn't even put up a strong defense. In fact, the Chief Justice kept asking, like, you know, giving time for them to come up with their arguments. And, you know, by the time we received the judgment, we recognized that we were at a critical time because the state, the current administration was getting ready to have a general elections and a new party would be elected. At the time, we recognized that the government accepted that decision but limited the interpretation of that decision. By 2008, when a new administration was in place, we saw an increase of violations almost immediately on the remaining 36 Maya communities. We work with 38 communities. We took 2 model communities. It almost seemed like it was an opportunity for the state to then go and say, well, since the other 36 communities have not brought this claim forward, we are going to do as much as we can to exploit every resource we possibly can find in these communities to sell, to grant leases, to move in onto those lands, and to ensure that we break the continuous occupation that the Maya people have had on these territories. One of them is a situation which sparked now a new effort to go back before the courts. In 2008, one of our chiefs, actually our current president right now, in his community in Golden Stream, a developer came onto his lands and began to bulldoze, tearing down mature cacao plantations. Cacao is the tree that we get chocolate from. And this is a big part of our livelihood in our Maya communities. Without any regard for this farmer's work on the land, in a matter of 3 days, completely bulldozed his corn plantation, his cacao, all his trees. And, you know, our farmers go out and say to him, look, this is my plantation, this is my area, what are you doing? And with a rifle in hand tells you, what proof do you have that you own this land? Where is your title? Where is your paper that shows that you have rights to these lands? And our farmers will tell you that our signature, our title, is in the plants that we have on there, is in the way of life. We don't have these paper titles. Nevertheless, our life is dependent on that, wiping away 30 years of my livelihood. And what do I have to say? Yeah. Even to the point when we decided, at that time, our traditional leaders told us that it's only a matter of time before it begins to happen rampantly in and around our communities. We must go back to the courts. We must seek the affirmation that the 2 model communities have had, regardless of the financial constraints, regardless of everything else. We need the same kind of affirmation by the courts. Well, in 2008, we began to file a class suit with the remaining 36 communities. When we got back to the court, it was interesting because the Chief Justice at the time was the same Chief Justice who made the decision in 2007. And we recognized at that time the government's effort to infiltrate our judicial system. They were trying to appoint judges. They were trying to give an early retirement to this Chief Justice at that time. And when he began and opened that hearing, it's interesting how he opened. He says, this is like deja vu. You know, I have made a ruling in this matter. But if I must state explicitly clear that these communities, and he named out each one of our communities, are no different from the 2 communities that we've already made a ruling on, and repeated the orders of the court. In fact, this time, he placed an injunction that basically told the government to cease and desist from interfering with our lands, whether that be by granting development concessions, whether that be by selling lands, whether that be by even coming onto our lands to speculate. And for us, that was, again, another great victory. In 2010, when this decision was given, and you notice now we didn't get the decision the same year, we got the decision 2 years later, we recognized that there was a change in attitude by the government because they began to recognize that the Maya people are organizing themselves. Those forests are no longer remaining quiet. There's a noise rising out from there. and a noise to contend with. And so at this point, they began to argue even harder. One, that the Maya people are not indigenous to the lands that we claim, the Kekchi and the Mopan Maya. They're saying that the Maya people that were there were the Chol Maya, and that they were all wiped out. And you know the history of, the history books say that all the Maya civilization disappeared. We're standing here live in person to tell you that we are not all disappeared, we're still in the forests. And like we argued before the courts, that we are the direct descendants of the ancient Maya. We continue to hold occupation and use of those lands. They also argued that we're recent migrants from Guatemala. So it speaks to the nature of even our nationality. While we continue to argue that we want to be a part of the development of Belize, we want to be recognized as citizens of Belize with rights, property rights that might not be the same as everybody else, but property rights equally important as everybody else, the rights that others enjoy. In 2008, when we won that victory, the government appealed that case, and it went before the Court of Appeals. This time, 3 judges sat to hear the case, and the case wasn't argued all over, but really the purpose of the Courts of Appeal was to see whether or not, the question of whether or not the Chief Justice made an error in his judgment. And by this time, at least on the substantive matter, the Court of Appeals ruled in our favor. The majority ruling was in our favor. There was 1 judge who disagreed. But for the most part, the other 2 judges said, it is explicitly clear that the Maya people have proven that they have rights based on their customary practices, based on their use, based on their occupation of these territories. The difference with the Court of Appeals decision this time, as much as it was a victory and it was in our favor, the Court of Appeals removed the injunction and thereby removed the protection and the security of those rights. Naturally, you ask, well, if we have rights to those lands, if the court agrees that we have rights to those lands, then who is going to protect those rights if not the state? If the state is not under obligation to protect those rights, then who is going to protect it? And at that point, we recognize that we can no longer sit and wait for the court decisions to move the hands of the government to begin to respect and honor and implement those orders. As a Maya people, we need to begin to create the space for us to live the way that we feel is most appropriate for us, most relevant for us, that safeguards the well-being of our people. And not well-being in the sense that, we want to run this race with everybody else, the race of development, but really to say we need to define our own forms of development. We need to define how we want to live and at what pace we want to live in our communities. And so at that point, while we continued the litigation strategy, we began to organize ourselves in a different way. Being able to say that as a Maya people, we need to recognize that we need to guard our own systems of governance. We need to guard our own systems that value our intimate connection to nature, to the environment that has sustained us. That we need to begin to assert ourselves in beginning to govern our own forests, in beginning to govern our own resource managements. And how do we do that? Though we've been practicing this for generations and generations, it's never been written down. It's never been put out there in a language that is understood by the outside. And so we've embarked on that process. The litigation process continues. Of course, the Court of Appeals decision was appealed by the government. And we anticipated this. Time and time again, our Prime Minister goes on national television to say the Mayas have gone far too far. And we recognize that they began to infiltrate even further into the judicial system. They tried to appoint a Court of Appeals judge who would have taken on our case. And I know had we allowed that to happen, we would have lost that case entirely. Because the Court of Appeals judge that they were trying to appoint was the brother of the Prime Minister of Belize. And obviously our legal team fought against that. In addition to that, we recognize that in 2009, while we were in the process of the hearing, the government cleverly amended the Constitution of Belize, which is the highest law in Belize, to change and to say that everything subsurface is the property of the state and the people of Belize. And now we understand why that effort was made. As we had anticipated, we knew that the government had an interest in oil development and oil exploration, and now they have granted oil permits in and around our territories. In fact, our entire 38 communities is under concession in a concession area called Block 19 for oil exploration. And they've started drilling in an area that is buffered by 5 of our communities, but uniquely also in an area that is co-managed as a park by our communities. So not only have they violated their own environmental laws, their own protected areas acts, they have violated the decisions of the court that affirm that Maya people have rights to those lands and that we needed to give consent to permits or concessions granted for any kind of exploration, resource exploration. Where are we now? Now, in 2014, we find ourselves going before the Caribbean Court of Justice. Our hearing this is the final court that the Belize government appeals to. We used to go before the Privy Council as we're a former British colony. Now we're going before the Caribbean Court of Justice. Again, this is a very new, it's a new court, and Belize signed on as a member of that court. The hearing will be held in March of 2015. And, you know, there's been an unbroken chain of decisions in our favor. We can't preempt what's going to happen at the Caribbean Court of Justice, but certainly I think that we have made a very strong case with respect to our rights to the lands and resources that we use. The government, we recently met with the Prime Minister, and at that meeting we recognized that the government is what they're asking the Caribbean Court of Justice to do is to clarify and to detail the nature of those rights and the extent of those rights. And so by way of our, we call ourselves bush liars, by way of our bush liar interpretation, we feel that what that means simply is that the government recognizes that the Maya people have put out a very strong argument with respect to their land claims. The chances of having a decision overturned at this level is probably unlikely. But what they're going to push for then is to say, well, what kind of rights? Is it usufructory rights? Is it, there was a word that was used last night, free, say again? The fee simple right. What kind of rights? For us, we have described time and time again that our way of life is dependent on these lands. Anything outside of our customary and traditional use of these lands would be a limitation of our rights, a violation of our land tenure systems, and would not be conducive to our way of life and our well-being as a Maya people. Now, despite all the court rulings, one might think a lot of people who read about the Maya land rights claims have used our claims to strengthen their own work in their areas. But recognizing that, as I started my talk, the litigation is only a tool. It's not the answer. It's not the solution to our problems. More importantly is the fact that Indigenous peoples around the world are beginning to organize themselves in a way that is outside of the courtrooms, in a way that looks at the threats not just to our lands and our environment, but to our connection as a people, to our social fabric that binds us and weaves us as a people. And when resources are to be exploited, the first tool that is used is to divide communities, to separate you into individuals that say, I want for myself. I am going to take for myself. That is contrary to our way of life as a Maya people. What we're safeguarding is not just a title to a piece of land, but to our entire philosophy as a Maya people, to our entire values as a Maya people, which says that it is for us collectively. The system of reciprocity, where I do for you, you do for me, we're a part of a community. I cannot live alone in this community. If I want to touch my home, and you saw our homes, it would take a long time if I had to do it myself. But when we come together collectively, and those of you who have been to Belize, and I see some faces where you have seen our homes, men come out of their homes to touch because they know that the time will come for their house to be touched, and their brothers and their neighbors and their friends will come and help them. And we do not need to have that cash flow in order for that to happen. But when that is broken, when that is eroded, when the social institutions are eroded, you have lost the battle. And that is why what Pablo and I do as a part of our work is really community organizing and mobilizing, which we believe is far more important than having put together a strong legal argument. Because at the end of the day, no matter how many lawsuits you win, if your people are not united, if they're not together, if they're not able to own that, then you have lost the battle already. I will not go further. I will leave some room for questions at the end. Pablo will speak now on governance and our traditional systems of governance.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you very much for giving us the time to share with you our experience. I want to first of all start by introducing myself. My name is Pablo Miss. I am Maya Erchi. Now, I'll take some time to talk about my last name because it's important that we share some of these little details of who we are, because it is what makes this world beautiful. So my last name is Miss. So a lot of you ladies would call yourself Miss Jane, Miss Mary, Miss Ann. So a lot of times, when you go to Maya communities, you will realize that our last names refer to something in nature. Cristina Koch, for instance, refers to turtle. Her last name, Koch, is turtle. So my last name, Miss, refers to cats. So I am actually a cat. So I want to take some time to explain the work that I'm involved in. I am a part of the movement, as Cristina mentioned. I am currently the program coordinator for the Maya Leaders Alliance. We work directly with 38 Maya communities, but I'm also a student of Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria. So I'm also doing some research work in the area of governance. Many of you come from different disciplines, I would believe, and the reason that you are engaged and that you're perhaps here is to enlighten yourself a little bit more about what people are doing in the area of Indigenous people's rights, Indigenous people's existence. And that I think is very important, because the issues of Indigenous people transcends them as a people. It is an issue that we have to collectively come to terms with as people of this world. We firmly believe that things are not where they should be, and that perhaps there is room for us to offer contributions to improving what exists. So in light of that then, Cristina spoke a lot about the Maya land rights legal strategy. Now the question we always ask is, to what end are we involved in that? And yesterday, as we sat in the class, I think Deborah's class, it became very clear that even in Canada, decades of litigation has been ongoing, and lots of things have been lost even by negotiating claims and so on. As a Maya people, we've also taken lessons from that, and we have learned. We're learning. Part of the reason for being here is also to further learn from what younger academics like yourselves are thinking about. What are your ideas? How are you seeing these things? And those, we hope, can also help us to see new perspectives, to create new perspectives on what we're engaged with. And the area of governance then becomes a very important aspect of any society, of any community. When I talk about indigenous governance, I'm referring to particularly the Maya form of traditional governance, the way Maya people decide at an individual and at a collective level how they will govern themselves and how they go about interacting with the outside, how they go about negotiating the intersect of their own law, of their own practices with the outside, without any pressures from obligations, for instance, under constitutional law or under the government. So those, I wanted to mention that from the onset. Because I am also speaking from the perspective of the Maya form of governance, I also wanted to highlight that, of course, the world is very diverse. So there are geographic, demographic, political characteristics that will distinguish our understanding, that will make difference our approach, our strategies in how we're trying to develop and push forward our form of governance. What is being used perhaps in Canada, in New Zealand, in the US might be different from what we're using in Belize. Now, in Belize, we have what is called now the Alcalde system, and that has become our form of governance. It has evolved into that. The Alcalde is a borrowed term. It is a Spanish term. It refers to a mayor, like a town, a city mayor. And I will speak a little bit about that later on. We have 39 Maya communities, and each of these communities have two leaders, what we call the Polilka or Colonial Lebal. They are essentially the ear, the eyes, the mouth of the community. The community is the fundamental authority for decision making. Now you begin already to look at the structure and the layers that's involved in this governance system. Other communities, other indigenous communities have hereditary chiefs, where authority, influence, control is really consolidated through lineage. In our case, it is really at the base. It is decentralized. In fact, as an alcalde, you take actions, you take decisions that was never consulted with the communities, even if the community would agree with that same decision you made. But because you bypass the process, you can easily be removed as alcalde. Our alcaldes now change every 2 years. So as a community member, whether you like it or not, you are expected to carry that burden of leadership at some point. So your individual behavior, the way you conduct your family, the way you raise your children, all become check and balance measures in the process of when you're called to serve as an alcalde. It also raises the responsibility upon you as a community member to ensure that you're consistent with the values, the principles of being a community member. Because if you are somebody who consistently is breaking the equilibrium of the community, keep in mind that at some point you might be asked as an alcalde and you will have to deal with those kind of behaviors too. But if you're known to be a good example in the community, then very likely there is a lot of confidence in you when you take up that position. So I share all of this so that we can begin to look at the layers and all the factors involved in bringing together the Maya form of governance. Now, 2 leaders from each community. From 39 community, you end up with 78 alcaldes. They form what is called now the Alcaldes Assembly. So this is the contemporary form of governance that now exists. The Alcalde Assembly then has a council, an executive council, and these ultimately represents the interests of the collective community. So the decision comes from the individual community, and at the individual community, majority decision is taken. At the collective, again, majority decision is taken. That's how the process works. It can be a very tedious process in terms of arriving at some majority position on matters. Now, there's no perhaps reason to romanticize indigenous communities, because we have to come to terms that there are issues, real issues that we're trying to address. And part of what I am looking at in my research is the implication of the land rights struggle on the Maya form of governance. How has it supported the existing form of governance that we have? How has it made it? How has it changed it? So these are there are some broad questions that I'm engaging with as I look at this area of work. Now, for instance, in my interviews, I spoke with elders that are 60 years and over, who have served as alcaldes. And when I posed the question of what's the future of the alcalde system, they were quick to say, well, it's not going to go anywhere. So long as Maya people exist, there will always be an alcalde system. Now, I asked the same question to younger alcaldes who are currently serving, and some of them would say, well, I think that maybe in a few years, we will be replaced by something else. So that then begins to sort of raise very, very, very important questions about indigenous forms of governance. I go further to ask, for instance, what are some of the reasons or the reasoning behind arriving at that position, that the alcalde will be replaced? Then you begin to hear, well, the alcaldes have done their work to organize the community, they've represented the community well, they've had historic court rulings, there have been injunctions on the government, but the government doesn't listen. The companies keep coming. In fact, now they give you some incentives. So maybe we have it wrong. Maybe they have it right. And so I think that it is important to begin to understand some of the implications that strategies that indigenous people are using in trying to assert themselves in terms of their rights. Some of the consequences that has brought about. In the case of Belize, it is becoming very obvious that we have invested a lot in litigations, and perhaps not invested equally in terms of continuing to strengthen our indigenous form of governance. So now that is an area of work that we are looking at, because there's no good reason to continue saying that we have an indigenous form of governance when the constituency itself is no longer in tune with the practices that has sustained that form of governance in the past. Now, one of the beauty of the alcalde system, I think, really jumps out in terms of its name itself. The alcalde system, while before pre-contact, was very organized, and upon contact, there was an attempt to sort of assimilate or integrate them into the colonial structure of governance, and that is part of the reason the name was changed to alcalde. In fact, it went further when they were given certain tools to use, which was symbolic of them now serving the crown. In fact, alcaldes were then instructed to be the agents to collect taxes from the residents while they lived when they were attempted to confine them in a reservations. Well, the alcaldes took up the name. I mean, the name has remained after so many years, but they also retained some fundamental characters of Maya form of governance. For instance, the process of decision making really has been strong, and it still is today, while being conscious that it's being chipped away. So the alcalde system being very flexible in accommodating things while maintaining fundamental characters has been a strength. And I think, again, if we look at just the last few years, that has also been very true in terms of the government attempting to place the alcalde system into law. The government did propose that they will hire a consultant for 3 weeks to develop a law that governs alcaldes based on their system, and they would become then formally integrated as part of local governance structure in Belize. Well, the alcaldes were quick to say, no. Yes, we would be interested in being a part of the local governance structure and being recognized there, but here's how we would want it. So the alcaldes went ahead and, after years of consultation, produced a document themselves that they feel speaks to what customary law is, speaks to the processes that's involved, and then gave that to government. Of course, we already know that's not going to go anywhere. So since 2011, that has been shelved. But what alcaldes went further to do is to take what they have now written and begin to apply it, because in essence, they merely documented practices and processes that they have been practicing over many years. That is their traditional duties and responsibilities. So I think that the ability of the alcaldes to remain flexible and accommodating is an important character, even as we go through the land rights process. The other aspect, I think, that's important to highlight is the question of all these rights to land. So now that we have rights to land, how are we going to govern ourselves now in contemporary times on these land? What's the role of our traditional form of governance in economic development, in economic partnership? What's the role of our traditional form of governance in rebuilding our communities, in ensuring that the younger generations remain in tune, remain a part of the traditional form of governance, so it remains relevant to them? So these are questions now that alcaldes are contending with, and these are interesting work that is now ongoing. There's a process where they're involved now to define their own process of economic development, to define their own process of governance. There's an entire revision right now of the governance structure that exists. And the fundamental goal there is to make sure that whatever the governance system becomes, that it retains, again, the essential characteristics of our form of governance, which is that the community is the fundamental authority for decision making. Now, in a very capitalistic system, that's pretty difficult to sell, because having to go and consult with the community and waiting for the community to get ready with a decision is time, and time is money wasted. And that has been the experience that we've seen. But the litigations then, the outcome of litigations then become an important tool for current leaders to assert that no, you're not going to push us. In fact, by law, it is now being required that you work with us. We're not just stopping you, we are actually proposing a way forward. So that is sort of the attitude now and the strategy that the alcaldes have taken in terms of translating the rights that has been affirmed into reality, and in terms of trying to pursue a system of governance that will be able to affirm or to make real those rights in a manner that goes back to what Cristina spoke about earlier, where it is not about accumulating wealth to a number of individuals, but it is actually about the well-being not only of the community but of the land and the territories that we're on. So those are some of the things that our leaders are currently engaged in right now. Now, from all of this thing, I think an important take home for us, at least with the Alcaldes, has been that for so many years, and again it goes back, I think, to what the case studies report were yesterday. For so many years, Indigenous people continue to try and articulate their ways of organizing, their ways of envisioning a future within existing constitutional structure or existing state policies. We are seeing that perhaps that might not be the approach to go, because you're already limiting yourself to existing structures, very structures that will become the subtle tool to maintain the status quo. So when Cristina speaks about, for instance, we're no longer waiting on the government, there are several reasons why that is possible in Belize. And as I said, it's because of our geographic isolation, our ability to accommodate change and retain essential part of our governance system. The government can shut down today, and the Maya people will not even know. We will continue living as happy people on a daily basis. So that ability, that power, is really essential in beginning to find ways of reinforcing our governance, reinforcing our community, pursuing economic development without pressures from existing state policies and so on. So I wanted to highlight that, because that is a major, I think, a major issue that even us as within the realm of academia struggle with, because we were trying to understand what is it exactly that Indigenous people are saying. And it's difficult to really come up with something that represents what exactly they feel is the rightful position that they have been saying. So I'm going to stop there, because we want to make sure that we give you the time to really engage with us. So if you have specific questions, as I said earlier, we're conscious that you have different interests, and we want to be able to share with you perhaps specific interests based on what you're thinking about. So I'm going to leave there for now.